Ever find yourself wondering, like, what actually goes down in a therapist's office? We talk about therapy all the time, but what does it actually look like? It can feel kind of mysterious.
It is a bit like a black box, isn't it?
Totally.
Yeah.
So today we're cracking open that black box and taking a deep dive into one specific type of therapy. It's called EMDR.
Ah, EMDR. It's having a moment.
It really is. And for good reason, which we'll get into. But first things first, what exactly are we diving into today?
Well, we're taking you behind the scenes of a real EMDR therapy journey using a case study from the book Rupture and Repair, a therapeutic process with EMDR therapy.
Great book title, by the way.
Isn't it? Really captures the essence of the process. And the author, Dr. Esly Carvalho, she gives us this incredible glimpse into how EMDR works in action. We get to follow along with a man we'll call Armando. Got to protect his privacy and all.
Of course, of course. So what's special about EMDR? I mean, isn't it just like regular talk therapy?
That's what's so fascinating. It's not. It's not about spending hours rehashing every detail of your painful memories. EMDR actually focuses on helping your brain process those memories in a healthier, more functional way.
Okay, so it's like hitting the refresh button on those old thought patterns, those negative loops that keep us stuck.
Exactly. And I think our listeners, they're all about efficiency, right? Getting to the root of the issue and making lasting change.
Absolutely. No time for endless rumination. So let's talk about Armando.
Yeah.
Dr. Carvalho describes him as a successful professional, but he has this secret kryptonite: public speaking.
Oh, man. Public speaking, it's a big one.
The worst, right? So relatable, even for those of us who don't struggle with it to the extent that he does. But can you imagine being at the top of your game professionally, but absolutely terrified to share your knowledge, crippled by anxiety?
It happens more often than you think. Even the most confident-seeming people can have these hidden struggles.
It's like everyone has that thing, right? The
Yeah.
thing that triggers their anxiety. But why is that? I mean, what's going on in the brain that makes something like public speaking feel so completely debilitating?
Well, a lot of it comes down to those past experiences, you see. Anxieties, like Armando's fear of public speaking, they often have roots that stretch back to our past. And we might not even be consciously aware of the connection.
Like an invisible thread connecting those dots.
Precisely. And to help us understand how this all works, Dr. Carvalho breaks down the therapeutic process into what she calls the 6 R's.
Ooh, I love a good framework. Give it to me straight. What are the 6 R's?
All right, get ready to take notes.
Yeah.
It's revision, rupture, reprocessing, repair, reconciliation, and resolution.
6 R's. I like it. It's a nice ring to it. So are these 6 stages something that you use with your own clients?
Absolutely. It's not a rigid formula or anything, but it provides a helpful roadmap for understanding the different phases of healing and growth in EMDR therapy.
A roadmap. I love that. So are we following that same roadmap today as we delve into Armando's journey?
We are. We're using it to navigate this deep dive from those initial ruptures to hopefully some lasting repair.
Okay, love it. A journey of rupture and repair.
Yeah.
So give us the backstory. Where does Armando's story begin? What do we need to know about his childhood to understand those deeper anxieties?
Well, Dr. Carvalho paints a pretty vivid picture of his childhood, and one thing that really jumps out is this theme of unpredictability.
Unpredictability.
Yeah, Armando grew up in a household where things were always a little, shall we say, unstable. And this instability, it leaves a mark. Especially for a child, it creates this underlying current of anxiety. You never know what to expect.
And that constant uncertainty, that feeling of walking on eggshells, it takes a toll.
Exactly. And one particular story Dr. Carvalho shares really highlights this. She calls it the club in the hallway incident.
The club in the hallway. Okay, now I really need to hear this story.
Oh, it's a powerful one. Picture this. Armando's around 10 or 11 years old.
Okay, so the club in the hallway incident, talk about a powerful visual. I mean, that image alone speaks volumes about the environment Armando grew up in.
It really does, doesn't it? And it's a perfect example of what Dr. Carvalho calls a rupture. It's those early experiences, especially within our families, that can shape our view of the world, often in ways we don't even realize.
It's like those experiences become a part of our wiring.
Exactly. They get embedded in our nervous system, our very being, and can manifest as anxieties, fears, or limiting beliefs later in life, like with Armando and his fear of public speaking.
And those ruptures, they don't just fade with time, do they?
Unfortunately, no, not always. They can linger. And sometimes those unresolved traumas can resurface in the most unexpected ways.
Speaking of unresolved trauma, we haven't even touched on another major rupture in Armando's life: the loss of his father to suicide when he was just a teenager. I mean, how do you even begin to process something like that?
It's incredibly difficult, and Dr. Carvalho doesn't shy away from the raw emotions tied to that event, the grief, the confusion, even the guilt, especially for Armando, who carries this heavy sense of responsibility.
It's like that feeling of always needing to be on guard as a child morphs into this even heavier burden of guilt. The what if I had done something differently?
Exactly, and it's crucial to remember these are really common responses to trauma,
Yeah.
even if they're not always logical.
Right? Our brains trying to make sense of the unthinkable. So how does EMDR even begin to address something as complex as survivor's guilt?
Well, it goes back to that idea of reprocessing. It's not about erasing those painful memories or pretending they didn't happen. It's about shifting our relationship to them, finding a new way to integrate them into our life story.
So it's less about changing the content of the memory and more about changing how we react to it, how it makes us feel in the present moment.
Exactly. And Dr. Carvalho highlights this incredibly moving moment in therapy, where Armando, the adult, gets to go back and comfort his teenage self. He reassures that younger version of himself that everything turned out okay.
Oh, wow. That just gave me chills. It's like EMDR allows him to offer compassion to those wounded parts of himself, the parts that were hurting so much back then.
And that's such a crucial aspect of healing, isn't it? Providing ourselves with that empathy and understanding even if we didn't receive it at the time of the trauma. And this takes us to the next R in Dr. Carvalho's framework, reprocessing.
Okay, so we've talked about rupture. Now, how does that rupture actually get repaired?
That's where the real magic of EMDR comes in. It's not about dissecting the trauma through endless discussion. It's about guiding the brain to process those memories in a safe and controlled way.
And that's where those eye movements come in, right? The bilateral stimulation.
Right. Though it's worth noting that the book doesn't get bogged down in the technicalities. What Dr. Carvalho beautifully illustrates is how that bilateral stimulation, whether it's eye movements, tapping, or sounds, helps engage different parts of the brain. And this, in turn, seems to facilitate the reprocessing of those traumatic memories.
So it's almost like giving the brain a nudge in the right direction.
In a way, yes. It's providing the optimal conditions for the brain to do what it naturally wants to do, which is to heal.
So powerful. I know we've talked a lot about the emotional aspects of EMDR, but I'm curious about the practical side of it. What does an EMDR session actually look like? I mean, do you just sit there and think about your trauma while moving your eyes back and forth?
Well, not exactly. And this is where I think Dr. Carvalho's book is so valuable. It doesn't shy away from the real-life details of therapy. One of the most compelling examples she gives is how Armando processes the memory of finding his father's suicide note. He starts with this overwhelming sense of guilt, like, maybe if he had been a better son, things would have been different. But through the EMDR process, guided by the therapist's insightful questions and reframing, he starts to release that burden.
It's like he's finally allowing himself to let go of those what-ifs that have been haunting him for years.
Exactly. And the way Dr. Carvalho describes it, it's not about denying his pain or minimizing the tragedy. It's about finding a new way to relate to that event, one that allows for healing and peace. And that release, it's often what people are searching for when they come to therapy. That feeling of lightness, of finally putting down that heavy weight they've been carrying for so long.
It's like EMDR gives you the tools to unpack that baggage and finally release what you no longer need to carry.
Exactly. And for some people, that release comes in the most unexpected ways. Like with Armando, Dr. Carvalho actually guides him through this imagined conversation with his deceased father. It's a way for him to say the things he never got to say, to express his hurt and anger, but also his love and forgiveness.
Oh, wow. I'm getting a little emotional just thinking about that. There's something so powerful about the idea that we can find closure, even in situations where we never got to say goodbye the way we wanted to.
It's about creating a sense of resolution, even if it's years, even decades later. And this idea of unfinished business, that's a key concept in EMDR. It's about addressing those lingering emotions, the things that keep us stuck in the past.
So even though Armando is making progress in processing his father's suicide, it sounds like there are still layers to uncover, new connections to be made, like that fear of public speaking.
Exactly. Healing, it's rarely linear. There's always more to explore, new insights to uncover.
So it's like peeling back the layers of an onion, right? Just when you think you've gotten to the core issue, there's always something else underneath.
It's true. And in Armando's case, that something else turns out to be his relationship with his sister. Even as he's making progress processing his father's death, Dr. Carvalho notes that there's still this unresolved grief and guilt surrounding his sister's passing years earlier.
We haven't really touched on that part of his story yet, have we?
No, not really. But it turns out it's a significant piece of the puzzle because even though she died when Armando was quite young, there's this lingering guilt that he carries with him, almost like he could have somehow prevented it.
Oh, wow. And that feeling of responsibility, especially at such a young age, that can really weigh heavily on a person.
Absolutely. And for Armando, it manifests as this need to always be in control, to anticipate every possible outcome, to never be caught off guard. It's like he's constantly trying to protect himself and others from pain.
Which, when you really think about it, ties directly back to his fear of public speaking, right? Being vulnerable in front of an audience, potentially facing criticism or rejection. It's like triggering that primal fear of not being in control, of not being able to protect himself from those painful emotions.
You've got it. And this is where EMDR, again, demonstrates its power. Because through the process of revisiting those painful memories, Armando is able to tap into a new level of compassion, both for his younger self and for his sister.
So it's not just about processing the trauma, but also about cultivating forgiveness and self-acceptance along the way.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that we did the best we could with the resources and understanding we had at the time, and that sometimes those past hurts, those regrets, they don't define us. They can actually become catalysts for growth and transformation.
I love that reframing. So often we see those past experiences as something to be ashamed of, something to hide. But what I'm hearing is that they can actually be sources of strength, opportunities to learn and evolve.
Absolutely. And in a way, that's what EMDR allows. It gives us a framework for integrating those past experiences into our present-day lives in a way that feels empowering rather than debilitating.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about the emotional and psychological benefits of EMDR, but I'm curious about the practical side of things. How long does this whole process take? I mean, is EMDR something you do for a few sessions and then you're cured?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
And I think it's important to remember that healing is not a linear process, nor is it a race. There's no set timeline. It looks different for everyone.
So true. We all have our own unique journeys, our own timelines for healing.
Exactly. But what we see with Armando is that even after several months of EMDR therapy, making significant progress on multiple fronts. I mean, remember how he even referred to the process as magic at one point?
Yeah, I love that part.
So even after all that, something interesting happens towards the end of his time with Dr. Carvalho. Those anxieties around public speaking, they start to creep back in.
Oh no, I was hoping he was home free. Public speaking is just the worst.
I know, right? But this is actually a really common experience in therapy. It's like those old patterns, those deeply ingrained beliefs, they have a way of resurfacing, especially as we're getting close to the finish line. It's almost like a final test, you know?
Oh, I see what you're saying. It's like the universe throwing one last curveball your way to see if you've really integrated those lessons, those new ways of thinking and being.
Precisely. And for Armando, this final hurdle ends up being a gift in disguise, because it allows him to really solidify those new neural pathways, those new ways of relating to himself and to the world.
So what happens? How does he overcome that final hurdle?
Well, Dr. Carvalho describes how they revisit some of those earlier memories, especially those related to his fear of judgment and his need for approval. And through that process, Armando has this aha moment. He realizes that the microphone, which has always been a symbol of fear for him, can actually be a tool for connection, a way to amplify his message and reach a wider audience.
Wow, that's such a powerful shift in perspective. From seeing the microphone as the enemy to seeing it as an ally. It's like he's finally stepping into his power, owning his voice.
Exactly. And that's the transformative power of EMDR. It's not about erasing the past, but about changing our relationship to it. It's about finding those hidden threads of meaning and using them to weave a new story, a story of resilience, of healing, and of hope.
Ugh, I love that. It's like what we've been talking about this whole time, that journey of rupture and repair. And it sounds like for Armando, that journey leads to a place of not just healing, but also empowerment.
Absolutely. And it's a reminder that even those experiences that initially feel like setbacks can actually be opportunities for growth.
I love that takeaway. That even in those moments when those old anxieties resurface, there's still so much hope for healing and transformation. Well, this has been quite the deep dive into the world of EMDR, and I think what stayed with me most throughout this whole conversation is this idea that even those of us who haven't experienced the same level of trauma as Armando, we can still benefit from understanding the power of our own stories, those hidden threads that connect our past to our present. And maybe, just maybe, by acknowledging those threads, by shining a light on them, we can start to rewrite those old narratives and create new, more empowering stories for ourselves.
Beautifully said. It's about reclaiming our stories, and in doing so, reclaiming our lives.
Exactly. And who knows, maybe that's a good place for our listeners to start their own reflections this week. What are those hidden threads in your own life? What are those old stories that are no longer serving you? And most importantly, what news stories are you ready to write?